Hey guys, tonight we're pouring ourselves into something toxic, literally. We're talking about the deadly bootleg alcohol that blinded, paralyzed, and killed thousands of Americans during Prohibition. Not the romantic speakeasy stuff with flappers and jazz. I mean the real bathtub gin, the wood alcohol nightmares, the stuff that turned your optic nerves into mush and left you convulsing on a tenement floor. And since this is our brand new channel, before you settle in, maybe take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what you find here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe pour yourself a glass of something legal and regulated. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was like to drink during Prohibition when every sip was a gamble with death? Did people really know they were drinking poison? What did bootleg whiskey actually taste like? Could you tell the difference between real gin and something distilled in a radiator? How many people went blind from a single shot? Would you risk it all for one drink at an illegal bar? Or would you become a teetotaler the moment you heard about your neighbor's paralysis? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up at 1925. Alcohol is illegal. Your throat is burning from last night's hooch, and you're not entirely sure you can still see clearly. Good luck. So picture this. It's January 16th, 1920. At midnight, the 18th Amendment goes into effect, and suddenly every bar, brewery, and distillery in America is supposed to shut down forever. The government called it the Noble Experiment, a grand moral crusade to save American families from the evils of drink. Temperance activists celebrated in the streets, convinced they just solved crime, poverty, and domestic violence in one legislative swoop. Spoiler alert, they hadn't. What they'd actually done was create the single largest illegal market in American history, handed organized crime a blank check, and set the stage for a public health catastrophe that would kill more people than alcohol ever had when it was legal. But hey, at least everyone had good intentions, right? The celebration was surreal. Temperance leaders gathered in churches and meeting halls, singing hymns and declaring victory over demon rum. Billy Sunday, a famous evangelist, held a mock funeral for John Barleycorn, a personification of alcohol, complete with a coffin and mourners dressed in black. "Goodbye, John," he proclaimed. "You were God's worst enemy. You were hell's best friend." The crowd cheered. Meanwhile, bar owners across the country were literally pouring their inventory into the gutters, watching thousands of dollars worth of whiskey, beer, and wine flow into the sewers. Some establishments shut down quietly, padlocking their doors and boarding up windows. Others threw massive final parties, serving free drinks until the clock struck midnight and the taps went dry forever. Or so everyone thought. What the temperance movement didn't anticipate was human nature. Americans had been drinking since the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. They drank beer for breakfast, whiskey for courage, wine for celebration, and rum for just about everything else. You can't erase centuries of cultural practice with a constitutional amendment and expect compliance. Within hours of Prohibition taking effect, people were already scheming ways around it. Those with foresight had stockpiled liquor in their basements. Doctors began writing prescriptions for medicinal whiskey, a legal loophole that made drugstores the new saloons. And enterprising criminals started plotting how to smuggle, manufacture, and distribute illegal alcohol on a massive scale. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Prohibition was supposed to reduce crime, but instead it created an entire criminal infrastructure. It was supposed to protect public health, but it would end up poisoning tens of thousands. It was supposed to strengthen families, but it tore them apart when breadwinners went blind or died from tainted liquor. The noble experiment was noble in name only. In practice, it was a disaster from day one, a textbook example of good intentions paving the road to hell. And that road was about to get very crowded with corpses. Let's talk about how Prohibition was supposed to function versus how it actually played out in the real world. The Volstead Act defined intoxicating liquor as anything containing more than 0.5% alcohol, banned its manufacture, sale, and transportation, and tasked a laughably small number of federal agents with enforcing it across an entire continent. We're talking about maybe 1,500 agents trying to police over 100 million people spread across millions of square miles. The math wasn't matching. Borders were porous, coastlines endless, and corruption so widespread that bribing a cop was cheaper than buying a drink. Within months, it became clear that America hadn't banned alcohol. It had just moved it underground, made it exponentially more dangerous, and basically told criminals to print their own money. The enforcement problem was staggering. Imagine being one of those federal agents tasked with shutting down every illegal, still, speakeasy, and smuggling operation in your district. You'd need to be part detective, part chemist, and part superhero. Most agents were none of those things. They were underpaid, overworked, and constantly tempted by bribes that could equal a year's salary for looking the other way during a single delivery. Some agents were genuinely committed to the cause, smashing barrels and arresting bootleggers with religious fervor. Others were on the take from day one, essentially working as security for the very criminals they were supposed to catch. Then there was the problem of geography. America's border with Canada stretched nearly 4,000 miles, much of it wilderness. Rum runners smuggled Canadian whiskey across the Detroit River, through the forests of Montana, and over the lakes of Minnesota. On the coasts, ships would anchor just outside the 3-mile territorial limit, an area known as Rum Row, and smaller boats would zip out to meet them, load up with crates of liquor, and race back to shore under cover of darkness. The Coast Guard tried to stop them, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. For every boat they caught, 10 got through. And then there were the loopholes. Religious institutions were allowed to use wine for sacraments, so suddenly everyone became very pious. Farmers could make cider and wine for personal consumption, but who was checking if that personal consumption included selling to neighbors? Industrial alcohol remained legal for manufacturing purposes, which is where the real nightmare began. The government knew bootleggers were stealing industrial alcohol and redistilling it for drinking, but instead of securing it better, they decided to poison it. Yes, you read that right. The government's solution to people drinking industrial alcohol was to make industrial alcohol deadly on purpose. It's like flossing with barbed wire to prevent cavities. Enforcement was a joke, compliance was non-existent, and the entire apparatus of prohibition was built on a foundation of wishful thinking and moral panic. It was doomed from the start. The only question was how many people would die before everyone admitted it wasn't working. Enter the bootlegger, part entrepreneur, part outlaw, entirely willing to risk prison or death to supply America's suddenly illegal thirst. These weren't all hardened gangsters, at least not at first. Many were ordinary people trying to make a living during economically uncertain times. Farmers distilled corn mash in their barns. Immigrants ran neighborhood stills in tenement basements. Small-time operators smuggled Canadian whiskey across the border in modified cars. But it didn't take long for organized crime to realize there was serious money in booze. Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and dozens of other mobsters built empires on bootlegging, raking in millions while bodies stacked up in the streets. And the product they were selling? Let's just say quality control wasn't exactly their top priority. In rural America, moonshining had been a tradition for generations. Mountain families in Appalachia had been making corn whiskey long before Prohibition, and when the law changed, they just kept doing what they'd always done. Except now there was a massive market willing to pay premium prices. They'd set up stills deep in the woods, hidden in hollows and caves, using copper tubing and wood-fired heat to distill mash into clear, high-proof liquor. Some of this moonshine was decent. Some of it could strip paint. All of it was illegal, and all of it was dangerous if the distiller didn't know what they were doing. The problem was, not everyone knew what they were doing. Distillation is chemistry, and bad chemistry kills. If you heat your mash too hot, you extract methanol along with ethanol. If you don't discard the first runnings, the heads, you're concentrating poison. If you use the wrong materials in your still, like lead pipes or radiator coils, you're adding heavy metals to your product. A skilled moonshiner understood these risks and took precautions. But Prohibition created an explosion of amateur distillers who had no training, no oversight, and no reason to care as long as they got paid. In the cities, bootlegging became industrialized. Organized crime syndicates set up networks that rivaled legitimate corporations. They had suppliers, distributors, enforcers, accountants, and lawyers. Al Capone's operation in Chicago brought in an estimated $60 million a year, over $1 billion in today's money. He owned politicians, judges, and police chiefs. His trucks delivered beer and liquor to thousands of speakeasies across the city, and anyone who interfered ended up in the Chicago River wearing concrete shoes. It's like working retail, except instead of dealing with angry customers, you're dealing with Tommy guns and territorial wars. But even Capone's organization wasn't above cutting corners. When Canadian imports ran short, they'd dilute shipments with industrial alcohol. When profits lagged, they'd water down the product and add coloring to hide it. The mob understood supply and demand, but they didn't care about consumer safety. If a batch of bad gin killed a dozen people in the tenements, so what? There were always more customers. Bootlegging wasn't just illegal, it was ruthless, immoral, and built on a foundation of exploitation and death. And business was booming. If you wanted a drink during Prohibition, you had options, none of them good. Bathtub gin became the drink of choice for millions of Americans. And yes, some people actually made it in bathtubs. The process was simple and horrifying. Take industrial alcohol, dilute it with water, add juniper oil or whatever flavoring you could find, shake it up, and pray. Sometimes people used glycerin to smooth it out. Sometimes they added creosote, which is literally wood preservative. The result tasted like paint thinner mixed with regret, burned your throat like acid, and had roughly the same alcohol content as rocket fuel. But it was cheap, it was available, and after a few glasses, you stopped caring what it tasted like. At least until the morning when you woke up blind. The name bathtub gin came from the fact that the bottles used were often too tall to fit under a sink faucet, so people filled them in the bathtub instead. Romantic, right? The base ingredient was usually industrial alcohol stolen from factories, warehouses, or medical suppliers. This stuff was never meant for human consumption. It was used in antifreeze, shellac, fuel, and embalming fluid. The government required it to be denatured, contaminated with toxic chemicals, to prevent exactly this kind of misuse. But bootleggers weren't deterred. They'd run it through makeshift stills, filter it through charcoal or bread, and hope they'd removed enough poison to make it survivable. Then came the flavoring process, which was pure kitchen alchemy. To make it taste vaguely like gin, you'd add juniper berries or juniper oil. To make it look like whiskey, you'd add caramel coloring, maybe some prune juice for body. To mask the horrible chemical taste, you'd throw in sugar, glycerin, or whatever else you had lying around. Some recipes called for iodine to give it color. Others suggested adding a bit of fusel oil, literally the poisonous byproduct of fermentation, to give it that authentic booze burn. It's like meal prepping for your own funeral. The truly desperate turn to even stranger concoctions. Jamaican ginger extract, sold as medicine, became a popular substitute because it was 70% alcohol and technically legal. People drank sterno, canned cooking fuel, by straining it through a cloth to remove the gel. Others consumed hair tonic, aftershave, or even embalming fluid when nothing else was available. Yes, embalming fluid. The same stuff used to preserve dead bodies. People drank it, got horrifically sick, and sometimes died, but not before telling their friends where they got it, because apparently near-death experiences weren't enough to stop the party. Bathtub gin wasn't just dangerous because of what was in it. It was dangerous because you never knew what was in it. Every batch was different. Every bottle was a gamble. You might get lucky and drink something that only gave you a brutal hangover. Or you might go blind. Or you might die convulsing on a bathroom floor while your friends argued about whether to call a doctor and risk arrest. There was no quality control, no ingredients list, no FDA approval, just a bottle of mystery liquid and the desperate hope that this time it wouldn't kill you. Speakeasies, those secret bars hidden behind barbershops, in basement clubs, and through unmarked doors, became the heartbeat of Prohibition-era nightlife. You'd knock on a door, whisper a password, and suddenly you were inside a smoky room filled with jazz, dancing, and drinks that could kill you. These places ranged from glamorous clubs where the wealthy sipped champagne to dingy holes where dock workers downed whatever rot gut was on offer. The atmosphere was electric, dangerous, and deeply American in its defiance. Women drank publicly for the first time in history. Social barriers relaxed. But underneath the glitter and music was a grim reality. Every drink served in a speakeasy was a roll of the dice. You never really knew what was in your glass, and by the time you found out, it was often too late. The word speakeasy supposedly came from the practice of speaking quietly about these places to avoid attracting attention. But there was nothing quiet about what went on inside. A typical speakeasy might be accessed through a fake bookshelf, a hidden staircase, or a door disguised as a janitor's closet. You'd give the password, something like Joe sent me, or the name of a local politician, and if the doorman liked your face, you were in. If not, the door stayed closed, and you walked away before things got uncomfortable. Inside, the scene varied wildly, depending on the neighborhood and the clientele. Upscale speakeasies in Manhattan catered to the wealthy and famous. They served imported champagne, real Scotch whiskey, and French wine, all smuggled in at great expense. The decor was lavish. Crystal chandeliers, velvet curtains, live jazz bands, and dance floors where flappers did the Charleston in beaded dresses that scandalized their grandmothers. These were places where Broadway stars, Wall Street bankers, and politicians mingled, secure in the knowledge that the right bribes had been paid to keep the cops away. But most speakeasies weren't glamorous. They were cramped, smoky basement rooms with rough wooden tables, sawdust on the floor, and liquor so harsh it made your eyes water. The clientele was working class. Factory workers, immigrants, laborers looking to forget their troubles for a few hours. The drinks were cheap and dangerous. Bathtub gin, homemade wine, beer that tasted like it had been brewed in someone's radiator. The entertainment might be a scratchy phonograph or a guy with a banjo in the corner, and the risk was very real. If the cops raided, everyone inside could be arrested, fined, or beaten. Women's presence in speakeasies was revolutionary. Before Prohibition, respectable women didn't drink in public establishments. But the 20s changed that. Flappers stormed into speakeasies alongside men, ordered cocktails, smoked cigarettes, and danced until dawn. It was liberation, rebellion, and excess all rolled into one. But it also meant women were exposed to the same deadly risks as men. That bathtub gin didn't discriminate. Neither did the methanol. And when a woman went blind or died from poisoned alcohol, society judged her twice, once for drinking and once for dying. Every speakeasy was a miniature act of rebellion. Every drink was a middle finger to federal law. And every night out was a gamble with death. But people kept going, kept drinking, kept dancing, because Prohibition had turned America into a nation of criminals. And if you were going to break the law anyway, you might as well have fun doing it. Here's where things get truly dark. Industrial alcohol, ethanol used in manufacturing, medicines, and fuels, was still legal during Prohibition. The government knew bootleggers were stealing it and redistilling it for human consumption, so they came up with a solution that can only be described as state-sponsored poisoning. They ordered industrial alcohol to be deliberately contaminated with toxic chemicals to make it undrinkable. Methanol, benzene, gasoline, iodine, zinc, mercury salts, all added by law to ensure that if you drank it, you'd suffer. The thinking was that fear of death would deter bootleggers. Instead, bootleggers just tried to remove the poisons and sell it anyway. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they didn't, and thousands of Americans paid the price with their lives, eyesight, and sanity. Let's be very clear about what denaturing means. It's the process of adding toxic substances to ethanol to make it unfit for human consumption. Before Prohibition, industrial alcohol was denatured with relatively mild chemicals, just enough to make it taste bad and discourage drinking. But when Prohibition started, and the government realized bootleggers were ignoring those deterrents, they ramped up the toxicity. By 1926, federal regulations required that every gallon of industrial alcohol contain not just methanol, but a cocktail of lethal additives: benzene, gasoline, acetone, and other compounds that could cause blindness, organ failure, and death. The logic was simple and brutal. If people knew drinking industrial alcohol would kill them, they'd stop drinking it. But that logic ignored several realities. First, bootleggers were good at chemistry, some of them, anyway. They developed methods to remove or neutralize some of the toxins through redistillation, filtration, or chemical treatment. These methods weren't foolproof, but they were good enough to convince bootleggers the alcohol was safe to sell. Second, many people didn't know they were drinking industrial alcohol. It was disguised as gin, whiskey, or rum, and sold in bars and speakeasies where customers had no idea what they were consuming. Third, desperation and addiction don't respond well to threats of death. People who needed a drink would take the risk, especially if they'd drunk industrial alcohol before and survived. The government's own chemists warned that this policy was dangerous. They argued that no amount of denaturing would stop bootleggers, and that the only result would be mass poisoning of American citizens. Their concerns were dismissed. Prohibition was a moral crusade, and collateral damage was acceptable. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, who oversaw enforcement, was unmoved by reports of deaths and blindness. His position was that anyone who drank illegal alcohol was a criminal, and whatever happened to them was their own fault. This was policy by punishment, and it killed indiscriminately. Rich or poor, young or old, guilty or innocent, if you drank industrial alcohol that had been improperly processed, you suffered. And the cruelest part, the government knew this would happen. They knowingly poisoned a product that they knew people would consume, and then blamed the victims when they died. It's like lacing tainted meat with arsenic and then shrugging when people get food poisoning. Except this wasn't accidental contamination. It was deliberate, systematic, and legal. Let's get scientific for a moment, because understanding methanol is key to understanding the horror of Prohibition-era drinking. Methanol, also called wood alcohol, is chemically similar to ethanol, the alcohol in beer and wine. But with one crucial difference: it's lethally toxic. When your body metabolizes methanol, it breaks down into formaldehyde and formic acid, the same stuff used to preserve dead bodies and strip paint. These compounds attack your optic nerve, causing permanent blindness. They poison your central nervous system, leading to seizures, coma, and death. And the truly cruel part? You can't taste the difference. A bootlegger could mix methanol into whiskey, gin, or rum, and you'd never know until you woke up in a hospital ward, screaming because the world had gone dark forever. Here's how the poisoning works, step by terrifying step. You take a drink of bootleg gin that's been cut with methanol. It goes down smooth, maybe burns a little, but no more than regular liquor. For the first few hours, you might feel fine, maybe even drunk in the normal way. That's because your body is busy metabolizing the ethanol first. But then the methanol's turn comes. Your liver enzymes, specifically alcohol dehydrogenase, start breaking down the methanol into formaldehyde. That formaldehyde is immediately converted into formic acid by another enzyme. And that's when the nightmare begins. Formic acid is devastatingly toxic to your cells, especially the cells in your optic nerve and brain. Your vision starts to blur. You might see halos around lights or experience tunnel vision. Some victims described it as looking through a fog that kept getting thicker. Within hours or days, depending on the dose, that fog can become permanent darkness. The optic nerve dies. There's no fixing it, no reversing it. You're blind for the rest of your life, and all because you had a drink at a party. But blindness isn't the only danger. Formic acid also disrupts cellular respiration, the process by which your cells produce energy. This leads to metabolic acidosis, a condition where your blood becomes too acidic. Symptoms include severe abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, confusion, rapid breathing, and eventually seizures and coma. Your organs start shutting down. Your brain swells. And if you don't get treatment fast, treatment that wasn't widely available in the 1920s, you die. The lethal dose of methanol is shockingly small. As little as 10 milliliters, about 2 teaspoons, can cause blindness. 30 milliliters can kill you. For comparison, that's roughly the amount in a single shot of heavily contaminated bootleg liquor. You could go to a speakeasy, order one drink, and never see sunrise again. And because methanol poisoning has a delayed onset, by the time you realize something was wrong, it was often too late to get help. Doctors in the Prohibition era were mostly helpless. The antidote to methanol poisoning is ethanol, which competes for the same enzymes and slows the breakdown of methanol into its toxic byproducts. But this wasn't common knowledge, and even when doctors knew to try it, they often didn't have pure ethanol on hand because, prohibition. So they'd watch patients go blind, seize, and die, unable to do anything but offer comfort and hope. Which wasn't nearly enough. The deaths started almost immediately after Prohibition began, but it took a while for the scope of the crisis to become clear. In 1921, hospitals in New York, Chicago, and Detroit started seeing patients with sudden blindness, paralysis, and convulsions. At first, doctors were confused. Then the pattern emerged. All the victims had recently consumed bootleg alcohol. Some had drunk bathtub gin at parties. Others had bought cheap whiskey from corner dealers. A few had simply accepted a drink from a friend who'd gotten a good deal on a bottle. Within days or even hours of drinking, they'd lose their vision. Their limbs would stiffen. Some would vomit uncontrollably and then slip into comas. And there was no antidote, no cure, just supportive care and hope, which wasn't nearly enough. The first victims were largely ignored. They were poor, often immigrants, frequently from neighborhoods the authorities didn't care much about. When a Polish factory worker in Chicago went blind from bad hooch, it didn't make the newspapers. When an Irish longshoreman in New York died convulsing on a tenement floor, nobody investigated. These deaths were filed away as the cost of doing illegal business. The victims had broken the law by drinking, so whatever happened to them was their own fault. At least, that's how the authorities saw it. But as the body count rose, it became impossible to ignore. By 1922, hospitals were overwhelmed. Bellevue in New York set up entire wards dedicated to alcohol poisoning cases. Cook County Hospital in Chicago reported dozens of admissions every week, many of them terminal. The victims ranged in age from teenagers to the elderly. Some were chronic alcoholics. Others were casual drinkers who'd simply gotten unlucky with a single bad bottle. Doctors started documenting the symptoms in medical journals, trying to understand what they were dealing with. The presentations were horrifyingly consistent: nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, blurred vision, headache, confusion, seizures, coma. Autopsies revealed swollen brains, damaged optic nerves, and organs ravaged by toxic chemicals. Chemical analysis of the victim's blood showed methanol, acetone, and other industrial poisons. It wasn't hard to figure out what had happened. The hard part was convincing anyone in power to do something about it. Public health officials sounded the alarm. Dr. Charles Norris, the chief medical examiner of New York City, was particularly vocal. He held press conferences, showing reporters the bodies of poisoning victims and explaining in graphic detail how government policy was killing American citizens. He called it murder. He demanded that the denaturing program be stopped immediately. His pleas fell on deaf ears. Prohibition was the law of the land, and the federal government had no intention of backing down. Meanwhile, the poisonings continued. Every weekend brought a fresh wave of victims. Every holiday was marred by deaths. New Year's Eve, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, any occasion people celebrated with drinks became a potential massacre. And still, people kept drinking, because what else were they going to do? Prohibition hadn't stopped the demand for alcohol. It had just made satisfying that demand a game of Russian roulette with bottles instead of bullets. If there was one moment that crystallized the horror of Prohibition, it was Christmas 1926 in New York City. Over the holiday week, more than 60 people died from poisoned alcohol, and hundreds more were blinded or hospitalized. Bellevue Hospital was overwhelmed. Bodies were stacked in hallways. Emergency rooms ran out of beds. The victims were immigrants, laborers, the working poor, people who'd bought cheap liquor to celebrate the holiday and instead celebrated their last conscious moments. Newspapers screamed headlines about the death toll. Families wept over loved ones who'd gone out for a festive drink and come home convulsing. And through it all, the federal government remained silent, refusing to acknowledge that their deliberate poisoning program had just killed dozens of Americans during the season of peace and goodwill. The week started normally enough. Christmas Eve saw the usual spike in alcohol sales as people prepared for celebrations. Street corner dealers did brisk business selling bottles wrapped in brown paper. Speakeasies stocked up for the holiday rush. Nobody knew that a particularly deadly batch of redistilled industrial alcohol had just flooded the market. It was cheap, it looked legitimate, and it was laced with enough methanol to kill a horse. The first victims started arriving at hospitals on Christmas Day. A young man collapsed at his family's dinner table, vomiting blood. An elderly woman went blind between the turkey and the pie. A father of 4 seized violently in front of his children and never regained consciousness. By December 26th, the emergency rooms were in crisis mode. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, but there was little they could do. The poison had already done its work. They could only watch as patient after patient slipped away, their organs shutting down, their brains swelling, their optic nerves dying. Dr. Charles Norris, New York's chief medical examiner, was furious. He held an emergency press conference and laid out the facts in brutal detail. The victims had all consumed bootleg alcohol. Chemical analysis showed lethal levels of methanol and other industrial poisons. These poisons had been added to industrial alcohol by government mandate. Therefore, the government had killed these people. It was simple, undeniable, and horrifying. The government knows it is not stopping drinking by putting poison in alcohol, Norris told reporters. It knows what bootleggers are doing with it, and yet it continues its poisoning processes, heedless of the fact that people determined to drink are daily absorbing that poison. The newspapers picked up the story, and suddenly the nation was paying attention. Poison liquor kills 31. Here in 4 days, screamed the New York Times. Photos showed grieving families, crowded hospital wards, and rows of simple wooden coffins. The human cost of prohibition was no longer abstract. It was concrete, immediate, and impossible to ignore. But the federal government's response was chilling. Treasury Department officials shrugged and said the victims had broken the law. Wayne Wheeler, the leader of the Anti-Saloon League and one of Prohibition's most powerful advocates, declared that the government was under no obligation to protect people who chose to break the law. The person who drinks this industrial alcohol is a deliberate suicide, he said. The message was clear. These deaths were acceptable. The war on alcohol would continue, no matter the body count. Families buried their dead in the days after Christmas. Many couldn't afford proper funerals, so bodies were interred in paupers' graves, unmarked and unmourned, except by those who'd loved them. The tragedy faded from the headlines as quickly as it had appeared. By New Year's Eve, people were drinking again, hoping the next bottle wouldn't be the one that killed them. Because what else could you do during Prohibition except roll the dice and pray? Methanol wasn't the only poison lurking in Prohibition-era bottles. Enter Jamaica ginger, commonly called Jake, a medicinal tonic that was technically legal because it was sold as medicine, not alcohol. It was about 70% alcohol, which made it very popular with drinkers looking for a legal buzz. But in 1930, bootleggers started cutting Jake with a chemical plasticizer called triorthocresyl phosphate, or TOCP, to pass government purity tests. TOCP is a nerve poison. It doesn't kill you quickly, it destroys your peripheral nervous system slowly and irreversibly. Tens of thousands of people, mostly poor Southerners, drank contaminated Jake and developed what became known as Jake leg, a permanent paralysis of the feet and hands. Victims walked with a distinctive limp, dragging their toes, unable to feel or control their lower limbs. There was no treatment. The damage was permanent. And it all happened because someone wanted to make a few extra bucks. Jamaica ginger had been sold as a patent medicine for decades before Prohibition. It was marketed as a cure for stomach ailments and menstrual cramps, and technically it did contain ginger extract. It also contained enough alcohol to get you thoroughly drunk, which is why most people bought it. During Prohibition, when real liquor was scarce and dangerous, Jake became incredibly popular. You could walk into any pharmacy and buy a bottle legally, no questions asked. It tasted awful, bitter, spicy, like drinking liquid fire, but mixed with soda or fruit juice, it was tolerable. More importantly, it was safe. Or so people thought. The problem started when the federal government began testing Jamaica ginger to make sure it actually contained ginger and wasn't just flavored alcohol. Legitimate manufacturers passed the test easily, but bootleggers who were producing fake Jake, basically just alcohol with some coloring and flavoring, started failing. So they got creative. They discovered that adding TOCP, an industrial chemical used in plastics and lubricants, gave their fake Jake the same viscosity and properties as real ginger extract. It fooled the government test perfectly, and it was cheap, readily available, and easy to mix in. What could go wrong? Everything. TOCP is a neurotoxin that attacks the myelin sheaths of your peripheral nerves, the protective coating that allows your nerves to transmit signals. When you drink TOCP, it doesn't hurt at first. You might not notice anything for days or even weeks. But then you start losing sensation in your feet. Your toes feel numb, then tingly, then nothing at all. You start walking funny, slapping your feet down because you can't feel where they are. Your hands begin to curl into claws. Your wrists go limp. And then the paralysis sets in, permanent and irreversible. The epidemic hit hardest in the South and Midwest, where Jake was especially popular among poor, often black communities. By the spring of 1930, doctors across the region were seeing an alarming pattern. Patients arriving with identical symptoms, all of them recent Jake drinkers. Estimates suggest between 30,000 and 50,000 people were affected. Some could still walk with canes or braces. Others were confined to wheelchairs. Many lost their jobs because they could no longer perform manual labor. The disability was permanent. There was no cure, no recovery, no hope. The government eventually figured out what had happened and banned the contaminated batches, but by then the damage was done. The manufacturers who'd added the TOCP were never held accountable. Most victims were too poor to sue, too marginalized to have their voices heard. They lived out their lives with Jake Leg, a permanent reminder that during Prohibition, profit mattered more than people, and the most vulnerable always paid the highest price. Blues musicians even wrote songs about it, preserving the tragedy in lyrics about dragging feet and crippled hands, a folk memory of an epidemic the government tried to forget. Let's be very clear about what happened here. The United States government, fully aware that people were drinking industrial alcohol despite the law, decided the solution was to make that alcohol so toxic that drinking it would mean death or disfigurement. They called it denaturing. It was systematic poisoning. By 1927, the feds had mandated that every gallon of industrial alcohol be laced with a cocktail of poisons. When people died, and they did, in massive numbers, officials shrugged and said, well, they broke the law. The chief medical examiner of New York City, Charles Norris, was horrified. He publicly accused the government of murder and called the policy legalized assassination. Prohibition advocates shot back that the real criminals were the bootleggers. But bootleggers weren't forcing anyone to drink poison. The government was literally adding it to the supply. The denaturing formula evolved over time, becoming progressively more deadly as bootleggers found ways to remove earlier versions of the poisons. The first formulas used relatively mild denaturants, things that made the alcohol taste terrible but weren't immediately lethal. Bootleggers figured out how to redistill it, filter it through charcoal, or neutralize the bad taste with flavorings. So the government escalated. By 1926, the required formula included 10% methanol, which was often fatal in much smaller concentrations. Then they added benzene, a known carcinogen, then gasoline, acetone, and kerosene, then mercury salts, zinc, and cadmium. Each addition made the alcohol more toxic, more likely to kill, and more impossible to purify completely. Treasury Department officials knew exactly what they were doing. Internal memos show they understood that people would continue drinking industrial alcohol regardless of how poisonous it became. They knew bootleggers would try to purify it and often fail. They knew innocent people would die, people who had no idea they were drinking poison, who trusted that the gin or whiskey they bought at a speakeasy was reasonably safe. And they decided those deaths were acceptable casualties in the war against alcohol. The policy had defenders. Wayne Wheeler of the Anti-Saloon League argued that anyone who drank illegal alcohol was committing suicide and had no one to blame but themselves. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon testified before Congress that the government had a duty to make industrial alcohol undrinkable, and if people died from drinking it anyway, that was their choice. Even President Coolidge, when asked about the poisoning deaths, remained unmoved. The law was the law, and lawbreakers would face the consequences, even if those consequences included blindness, paralysis, and death. But not everyone in government was complicit. Some officials, particularly in public health and medical fields, were appalled. Dr. Charles Norris used his position as New York's chief medical examiner to document every poisoning death in gruesome detail. He held autopsies for the press, showing them the ravaged organs and destroyed optic nerves. He gave interviews condemning the policy as mass murder. He testified before Congress, begging them to stop poisoning American citizens. He was ignored, dismissed as an alarmist, and told to mind his own business. The poisoning program continued throughout Prohibition. Estimates vary, but historians believe that government-mandated denaturing killed at least 10,000 people and blinded or disabled tens of thousands more. It was one of the darkest chapters in American public health history, a deliberate policy of poisoning that targeted the most vulnerable, the poor, the desperate, and the uninformed. And when Prohibition finally ended in 1933, the government never apologized, never compensated the victims, never acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, killing your own citizens to enforce a moral crusade was a bad idea. The people dying from poisoned alcohol weren't wealthy socialites sipping cocktails at exclusive clubs. They were the poor, the working class, immigrants, and marginalized communities who couldn't afford the safer, smuggled imports. Rich folks drank champagne from Canada or whiskey from Europe, expensive but clean. Poor folks drank whatever they could afford, which was usually the cheapest, deadliest rot gut available. Entire neighborhoods were devastated. In immigrant communities in New York, Chicago, and Cleveland, families lost breadwinners to blindness or death. Veterans who'd survived the trenches of World War I came home and were felled by a shot of methanol in a basement bar. Young women celebrating their first taste of freedom collapsed in speakeasy bathrooms. The victims had names, families, dreams, and they all died because they wanted a drink in a country that had made drinking a death sentence. Take the story of Giuseppe Maroni, a 42-year-old Italian immigrant who worked in a garment factory in Manhattan's Lower East Side. On December 24, 1926, Giuseppe stopped at a neighborhood speakeasy to buy a bottle of what he thought was whiskey to celebrate Christmas with his family. It cost him $2, nearly half a day's wages. That night, after dinner, he poured drinks for himself and his wife. Within hours, both were violently ill. Giuseppe went blind by morning and died 2 days later. His wife survived, but never regained her sight. Their 5 children were left orphaned, raised by relatives who could barely afford to feed themselves. Giuseppe's crime? Wanting to celebrate Christmas with his family. Or consider Mary O'Brien, a 23-year-old stenographer who'd recently moved to Chicago from a small town in Iowa. She was smart, ambitious, and eager to experience the excitement of city life. One Saturday night, she went dancing at a speakeasy with friends from work. Someone bought a round of gin fizzes. Mary had never been much of a drinker, but she didn't want to seem unsophisticated, so she finished her glass. By Monday morning, she couldn't see well enough to type. By Wednesday, she was completely blind. She lost her job, couldn't afford her apartment, and had to move back to Iowa to live with her parents. Her dreams of independence and city life died in a single cocktail. The victims were disproportionately immigrants and minorities, communities that lacked political power and social safety nets. Irish, Italian, Polish, and Jewish neighborhoods in major cities saw higher rates of poisoning deaths because residents there had less access to expensive imported liquor and relied more heavily on cheap local bootleg. Black communities in the South were ravaged by the Jake Leg epidemic, with thousands left permanently disabled by contaminated Jamaica ginger. These weren't accidents of fate. They were the predictable consequences of a policy that treated some lives as more expendable than others. Veterans were another vulnerable group. Men who'd survived gas attacks, trench warfare, and shell shock came home to find that Prohibition had turned their own country into a different kind of battlefield. Many self-medicated their trauma with alcohol, and when that alcohol was poisoned, they paid with their lives or their sight. One veteran, blinded by methanol poisoning in 1927, told a reporter, "I survived Verdun. I survived the Argonne, and I came home to be killed by my own government with a bottle of gin." The human cost of prohibition wasn't measured in statistics. It was measured in shattered families, lost potential, and communities torn apart by preventable tragedy. Every victim had a story, a life that mattered, dreams that were stolen by a toxic combination of bad policy, criminal greed, and societal indifference. They deserve to be remembered not as numbers or cautionary tales, but as people who were failed by every system that was supposed to protect them. Here's a question you might not have considered. What did this poison actually taste like? Accounts from the era describe bootleg liquor as vile, harsh, burning, chemical, and often mixed with fruit juices, sugar, or soda to mask the horror. Bathtub gin tasted like turpentine with a hint of juniper. Moonshine burned going down and left a metallic aftertaste. Some bootleggers tried to mimic whiskey by adding caramel coloring and prune juice. Others just bottled whatever came out of the still and hoped for the best. People who survived drinking poisoned alcohol often said they knew something was wrong immediately. The taste was sharper, the burn more intense, the hangover catastrophic. But by the time your body sent those warning signals, the damage was often already done. You'd swallowed the poison. Now you just had to wait and see if you'd wake up tomorrow, and if you did, whether you'd be able to see the sunrise. Imagine taking your first sip of bathtub gin. The smell hits you first, a sharp, chemical odor that makes your eyes water, nothing like real gin. You take a small sip anyway because everyone around you is drinking and you don't want to look scared. The liquid touches your tongue and it's like licking a battery. The burn isn't the pleasant warmth of good whiskey. It's harsh, immediate, and wrong. It sears your throat going down, leaving a chemical aftertaste that no amount of mixer can completely hide. Your stomach lurches. Your eyes tear up. Someone claps you on the back and laughs. Strong stuff, right? You nod and try not to vomit. Some bootleg liquor was better than others, relatively speaking. Moonshine made by experienced distillers could be decent, high proof, and harsh, sure, but clean if done properly. The problem was knowing which bootlegger knew what they were doing. A skilled moonshiner understood the importance of discarding the heads and tails of the distillation, the first and last portions that contain the highest concentrations of methanol and other toxins. They knew to use proper copper stills to control the temperature carefully to test their product before selling it. But Prohibition created thousands of amateur distillers who had no training and no standards. Their product ranged from merely terrible to actively lethal. The mixers people used to hide the taste became part of Prohibition folklore. Ginger ale was popular because its strong flavor masked chemical notes. Fruit juices, especially pineapple and orange, helped disguise the harshness. Some speakeasies served cocktails with such elaborate names and complicated recipes that customers couldn't taste how bad the base alcohol was. The bee's knees, for example, combined gin, lemon juice, and honey, sweet and sour enough to hide almost anything. The sidecar mixed cognac, orange liqueur, and lemon juice into a citrus bomb that made even bathtub brandy palatable. But no amount of mixing could completely hide the truth. Experienced drinkers could tell the difference between real imported liquor and domestic bootleg immediately. The mouthfeel was different, the burn sharper, the aftertaste chemical. Some people claimed they could identify specific poisons by taste alone. Methanol had a slightly sweeter note, benzene had a distinct solvent quality, and fusel oils left a burning sensation that lasted for hours. Whether these claims were true or just desperate attempts to feel in control of an uncontrollable situation is hard to say. The worst part was the unpredictability. You could drink from the same bootlegger twice and have completely different experiences. One bottle might be tolerable, even enjoyable after enough mixing. The next could blind you. There was no consistency, no quality control, no way to know if this drink would be your last drink ever. So people developed rituals and superstitions. They'd pour a little out for the dead before drinking. They'd make sure to eat a full meal first. They'd drink slowly, waiting to see if anyone else got sick. But in the end, every drink was a gamble, and the house always won eventually. Were bootleggers evil? It's complicated. Some absolutely were, ruthless criminals who knowingly sold poison and didn't care who died as long as they made money. But others were just trying to survive the Great Depression, feeding their families by making booze in their basements. Many didn't fully understand the chemistry of what they were distilling. They thought if they filtered it enough or diluted it properly, it would be safe. They were wrong, and when people started dying, the successful bootleggers didn't stop. They just got better at hiding the evidence. The line between entrepreneur and murderer blurred until it disappeared entirely. In the world of Prohibition, everyone was complicit. The drinkers who demanded cheap alcohol, the sellers who supplied it, the cops who looked the other way, and the politicians who created the conditions for catastrophe in the first place. Consider the small-time bootlegger, maybe a farmer in rural Kentucky who'd been making corn whiskey for his own consumption for years. When Prohibition hit and he realized people would pay good money for his product, he scaled up production. He wasn't trying to poison anyone. He was trying to keep his farm afloat during tough economic times. He used the same methods his grandfather had taught him, and most of the time, his whiskey was fine. But occasionally, if he wasn't careful, if he was tired or distracted, if he let the temperature run too hot or forgot to discard the heads, methanol would slip into the batch. And when someone went blind or died, was it murder, negligence, just a tragic accident in an illegal industry? Then there were the industrial operators, the ones who ran large-scale operations with trucks, distribution networks, and connections to organized crime. These bootleggers knew exactly what they were doing. They bought industrial alcohol in bulk, ran it through redistillation equipment that removed most but not all of the poisons, and sold it as premium liquor at premium prices. They knew some of their product was still toxic. They knew people would get sick, some would go blind, and a few would die. But the profit margins were too good to pass up. They rationalized it. People knew the risks of drinking during Prohibition. Everyone was breaking the law anyway. And besides, more people died from car accidents than from bad gin. So, what was the big deal? The big deal was that car accidents were accidents. Selling poison disguised as liquor was something else entirely. But in the moral vacuum of Prohibition, these distinctions got lost. Bootleggers saw themselves as businessmen, not murderers. They were simply meeting market demand in a profitable way. If the government hadn't banned alcohol, none of this would be necessary. So really, weren't the politicians the real criminals? Some bootleggers developed a twisted sense of professional pride. They'd test their batches, avoid the worst industrial denaturants, and genuinely try to produce something that wouldn't kill their customers. Not out of compassion exactly, but out of business sense. Dead customers don't come back. These bootleggers saw themselves as craftsmen, maintaining standards in an unregulated industry. They'd mock the operators who cut every corner and sold outright poison, even as they themselves sold alcohol that was only slightly less dangerous. And then there were the ones who simply didn't care. Sociopaths who saw human life as nothing more than a balance sheet entry. They'd cut their product with anything that increased volume and profit. Water, industrial alcohol, even wood alcohol stolen from paint factories. They'd reuse bottles from legitimate brands to fool customers into thinking they were getting the real thing. When people died, they'd shrug and move the operation to a new neighborhood. These were the true villains of the Prohibition era. People who would sell their own mothers if the price was right. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The system made them all possible. Prohibition created an environment where normal people could become casual poisoners, where business decisions could mean death, and where the line between survival and murder dissolved in a haze of economic desperation and moral confusion. The bootleggers weren't the disease. They were a symptom of a policy that was fundamentally broken from day one. Imagine being a doctor in 1927 and watching patient after patient stumble into your emergency room, writhing in pain, vomiting, going blind, seizing, dying, and knowing there was almost nothing you could do. Methanol poisoning had no antidote. You could try gastric lavage, pump the stomach, administer oxygen, maybe inject ethanol to slow the metabolism of methanol into its deadlier components. But often it was too late. The damage was done. Doctors watched young men and women lose their sight in real time, their eyes clouding over as their optic nerves died. They held the hands of patients as they convulsed and slipped into comas. They filled out death certificates that listed cause of death as acute alcohol poisoning when everyone in the room knew it was murder by policy. Hospitals were overwhelmed, especially in poor neighborhoods. Bellevue in New York had entire wards dedicated to bootleg liquor casualties. And through it all, the suffering was compounded by the stigma. Victims were criminals, after all. They'd broken the law. Some people thought they deserved what they got. The medical professionals of the Prohibition era lived in a special kind of hell. They'd gone into medicine to save lives, to heal, to ease suffering. Instead, they found themselves presiding over an endless parade of preventable deaths and irreversible injuries, powerless to do anything but watch. Dr. Alexander Gettler, the toxicologist who worked with Charles Norris at the New York Medical Examiner's office, spent his days analyzing tissue samples from the dead, documenting poison after poison after poison. He'd find methanol in their blood, formaldehyde in their eyes, benzene in their livers. He'd write detailed reports proving that government-denatured industrial alcohol was killing people. And then he'd watch as those reports were filed away and ignored. Emergency room doctors developed a grim expertise in alcohol poisoning. They could recognize the symptoms immediately. The patient stumbling in, confused and nauseous. The distinctive smell of ketones on their breath. The rapid, shallow breathing of metabolic acidosis. The dilated pupils that didn't react to light, signaling optic nerve damage. They'd order the stomach pumped, though by the time patients arrived, the alcohol was usually already absorbed. They'd administer sodium bicarbonate to combat the acidosis. And then they'd wait, hoping the patient had consumed a survivable dose, knowing that hope was often all they had to offer. The treatment protocols were primitive by modern standards. Some doctors tried giving patients massive doses of ethanol, real whiskey if they could get it, medicinal alcohol if they couldn't, based on the theory that it would compete with methanol for the enzymes that metabolized it. This sometimes worked, slowing the production of toxic formaldehyde and formic acid and giving the body more time to excrete the methanol. But dosing was guesswork, and if you gave too much ethanol, You just add alcohol poisoning on top of methanol poisoning. It's like fighting fire with a slightly smaller fire that might also burn down the house. Nurses bore the brunt of the emotional toll. They were the ones who sat with patients through the long nights, listening to them scream as their vision faded, holding their hands as they died, comforting families who couldn't understand why a few drinks at a party had turned into a funeral. They were the ones who cleaned up the vomit and blood, who changed the bedding, who whispered prayers over patients who were too far gone to hear them. Many nurses developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD, nightmares, emotional numbness, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from caring for people you couldn't save. The stigma made everything worse. When a well-dressed businessman came in with alcohol poisoning, the staff would quietly treat him and send him home with instructions to be more careful. But when a poor immigrant or a black laborer came in with the same symptoms, they might be left to wait for hours, lectured about their moral failings, or even reported to the police. The assumption was that respectable people didn't drink bootleg liquor, so if you were poisoned, you must not be respectable. It was cruel, unjust, and tragically common. Some doctors became activists. They testified before Congress, spoke to the press, and publicly condemned the government's poisoning policy. They risked their careers and reputations to demand change. But most just kept their heads down and did their jobs, because what else could they do? They couldn't stop prohibition. They couldn't force the government to stop denaturing alcohol. They couldn't prevent people from drinking poison. All they could do was pick up the pieces and try to comfort the dying. And night after night, year after year, that's exactly what they did. Desperate drinkers came up with all sorts of folk methods to test whether their alcohol was safe. Some claimed you could light it on fire. If it burned blue, it was safe. If yellow, it was poison. Others said to pour a little on a spoon and see if it evaporated cleanly. One myth claimed that adding a raw egg to the bottle would expose methanol. None of these methods worked. Methanol burns just like ethanol. It evaporates just like ethanol. It looks, smells, and tastes almost exactly like ethanol until it's already destroying you from the inside. The truth was simple and brutal. There was no reliable way to test bootleg alcohol without a chemistry lab. Every drink was a gamble. Some people developed elaborate superstitions, refusing to drink anything unless it came from a trusted source or had been vouched for by someone they knew. But trust was a thin shield, and even trusted sources sometimes sold poison without knowing it. The flame test became one of the most widespread myths of the Prohibition era. The logic seemed sound. Pour a little liquor into a spoon, light it on fire, and watch the color of the flame. Pure ethanol supposedly burned blue, while methanol and other contaminants burned yellow or orange. Thousands of people relied on this test before drinking, confident they were protecting themselves. They were wrong. Both methanol and ethanol burn with a pale blue flame that's almost invisible in daylight. The yellow color people associated with bad alcohol usually came from impurities that had nothing to do with toxicity, dissolved sugars, coloring agents, or bits of charred wood from the barrel. You could have perfectly poisonous alcohol that burned blue and relatively safe alcohol that burned yellow. The test was worse than useless. It gave people false confidence. Another popular method was the evaporation test. You'd pour a small amount of alcohol onto a clean plate or mirror and let it evaporate. If it left no residue, it was supposedly safe. If it left a film or smell, it was contaminated. This test had a grain of truth to it. Pure ethanol does evaporate cleanly, but methanol also evaporates cleanly. So does acetone, benzene, and most of the other poisons used to denature industrial alcohol. The only things this test actually detected were heavy oils and solids, which, while unpleasant, were rarely the chemicals that killed you. The egg test was pure folklore, with zero basis in chemistry. The myth claimed that if you dropped a raw egg into a bottle of liquor and it turned white or cloudy, the alcohol was poisoned. If the egg stayed clear, you were safe. People swore by this method, passing it down through families and neighborhoods like sacred knowledge. But eggs react to alcohol concentration and temperature, not to specific toxins. You could drop an egg into pure, safe vodka and it would turn cloudy. You could drop an egg into lethal methanol and it might stay clear. The test told you absolutely nothing about safety, but it made people feel like they had some control in an uncontrollable situation. Some drinkers relied on the expertise of their bootlegger or speakeasy owner. "Joe's stuff is always good," they'd tell each other. "I've been buying from him for months and never had a problem." This was actually one of the more reasonable approaches. A bootlegger with a reputation for safe product had a financial incentive to maintain that reputation. But even the most careful bootlegger could slip up. A batch could get contaminated. A supplier could change. A new employee could make a mistake. And when that happened, all those months of safe drinking meant nothing. The most reliable test was also the most macabre. Let someone else drink first and wait to see if they went blind. This wasn't a joke. People actually did this. At parties, the person who bought the bottle would take the first sip, and everyone else would watch carefully for the next few hours. If the first drinker seemed fine, the others would indulge. If the first drinker started vomiting or complaining of blurred vision, the bottle got dumped and everyone went home. It was Russian roulette by proxy, and it worked about as well as you'd expect. By the time symptoms appeared, everyone who drunk from that bottle had already consumed the poison. The damage was done. The sad truth was that no folk test could protect you during Prohibition. The only real safety was abstinence, importing expensive foreign liquor, or having connections to a bootlegger who genuinely knew chemistry and cared about not killing customers. For everyone else, drinking was a leap of faith into darkness, hoping this time the landing wouldn't kill you. Not everyone in the government was complicit in the poisoning. Some chemists and public health officials tried desperately to sound the alarm. Alexander Gettler, a toxicologist working with New York's medical examiner Charles Norris, spent years analyzing samples of bootleg alcohol and documenting just how deadly they were. He published reports showing that industrial alcohol denatured by the government was showing up in the bodies of the dead and the blinded. He testified before Congress, begging them to stop adding poisons to industrial alcohol. His pleas were ignored. Prohibition was a moral crusade, and the casualties were acceptable. Meanwhile, a few brave chemists worked in secret to develop methods to purify industrial alcohol, removing the poisons so it could be safely consumed. They were breaking the law, of course, but they saw themselves as saving lives. Some were arrested, others went underground, and the poisonings continued. Alexander Gettler was a Hungarian immigrant who'd come to America seeking opportunity and found himself documenting a mass poisoning campaign instead. Working in the basement laboratory of the New York Medical Examiner's Office, he pioneered forensic toxicology techniques that are still used today. He could take a sample of tissue from a corpse and tell you exactly what killed them, down to the specific poison and approximate dose. During Prohibition, his skills were in constant demand. Body after body arrived on his examination table, and day after day he found the same pattern: methanol, benzene, acetone, and other industrial denaturants, all added to alcohol by government mandate, all now dissolved in the blood and tissues of American citizens. Gettler documented everything meticulously. He published papers in medical journals with titles like The Toxicology of Methyl Alcohol and Fatal Poisonings from Denatured Alcohol. He compiled statistics showing that poisoning deaths had skyrocketed since the government strengthened its denaturing formulas. He prepared exhibits for court cases, showing judges and juries the chemical evidence of systematic poisoning. And he testified before Congress multiple times, standing in front of politicians and explaining in clear, scientific terms that their policy was killing people. The response was always the same: sympathy, perhaps, but no action. Senators would nod gravely, thank him for his service, and then vote to continue the denaturing program. Representatives would express concern, promise to look into it, and then do nothing. The moral imperative of prohibition outweighed any number of dead citizens. Gettler left those hearings frustrated and angry, knowing that more bodies would arrive in his laboratory, more families would be destroyed, and more preventable deaths would stack up while the government looked away. But Gettler wasn't alone. Across the country, other chemists were working to understand and combat the poisoning crisis. Some worked within the system, like Gettler, documenting the deaths and demanding policy changes. Others worked outside it, developing clandestine methods to purify denatured alcohol. These chemist bootleggers understood that if the government wouldn't stop poisoning the alcohol supply, someone had to find a way to remove the poisons. The purification process was complex and dangerous. You had to redistill the alcohol carefully, controlling the temperature to separate out the methanol, which has a lower boiling point than ethanol. You had to use activated charcoal to filter out benzene and other organic contaminants. You had to test the final product to make sure you'd actually removed the poisons and not just concentrated them. A skilled chemist with proper equipment could do this reliably. An amateur with a makeshift still could not. The difference between the two was often the difference between safe liquor and a bottle of death. Some of these underground chemists were motivated by profit. They could charge premium prices for properly purified alcohol. Others were motivated by genuine humanitarian concern. They'd seen friends go blind, neighbors die, communities devastated. They had the skills to help, and they used them. Legality be damned. When ZOB authorities raided their operations, they were charged with violating prohibition laws, but they saw themselves as medical personnel, not criminals. They were removing poison from the supply chain, saving lives that the government seemed perfectly willing to sacrifice. A few became folk heroes in their communities. Stories circulated about the chemist who only sold tested, safe product. The professor who'd lost his university job for speaking out against denaturing and now ran a purification operation from his basement. The pharmacist who used his laboratory after hours to clean industrial alcohol for neighbors who couldn't afford imported liquor. These people risked everything to fight a policy they saw as immoral and murderous. Most were eventually caught, fined, or imprisoned. But for everyone arrested, another took their place, because the demand was endless and the alternative was watching people die. While ordinary people were dying, organized crime was thriving. Bootlegging wasn't just profitable, it was the foundation of the American Mafia's rise to power. Figures like Al Capone in Chicago, Meyer Lansky in New York, and the Purple Gang in Detroit made millions, built empires, and corrupted entire city governments, all on the back of illegal alcohol. But here's the thing. The mob's alcohol wasn't necessarily safer. Sure, some high-end operations imported real whiskey from Canada or Europe and sold it to wealthy clients. But plenty of mob-run operations also cut corners, watered down shipments, mixed industrial alcohol into their products, and sold poison just like everyone else. When people died, the mob didn't care. Business was business. Capone himself famously said he was just giving people what they wanted. And if what they wanted sometimes killed them, well, that was the cost of doing business during Prohibition. Al Capone ran Chicago like a corporate CEO, except his board meetings involved Thompson submachine guns, and his quarterly reports were written in blood. At the height of his power, his organization controlled hundreds of speakeasies, breweries, and distilleries. He employed over 1,000 people, drivers, guards, distributors, accountants, lawyers, and enforcers. His income was estimated at $60 million a year, more than most legitimate corporations. And almost all of it came from bootlegging. Capone understood branding. His organization developed a reputation for reliable product, which in Prohibition terms meant alcohol that probably wouldn't kill you immediately. His beer was brewed in professional facilities using real ingredients. His whiskey was often genuine Canadian or European imports, smuggled across the border in trucks with hidden compartments. He hired chemists to test his product and remove the worst contaminants from redistilled industrial alcohol. Not because he cared about public health, but because dead customers were bad for business. But even Capone wasn't above selling inferior or dangerous product when it suited him. His organization had different product lines for different markets. The wealthy got real Scotch whiskey and French champagne at premium prices. The middle class got decent beer and passable gin. The poor got whatever rotgut was cheapest to produce, often cut with industrial alcohol that hadn't been fully purified. If people in the slums went blind from his gin, well, they were buying the cheapest product available. You get what you pay for. Other mob operations were even less scrupulous. The Purple Gang in Detroit controlled most of the rum running across the Canadian border, but they also ran cutting plants where legitimate imported whiskey was watered down and mixed with industrial alcohol to triple or quadruple the volume. They'd take one case of real Canadian Club and turn it into 4 cases of Canadian Club, mixing in redistilled industrial alcohol, water, and coloring agents. The result looked and tasted similar enough that most customers couldn't tell the difference. At least, not until the methanol started destroying their optic nerves. Meyer Lansky in New York took a different approach. He focused on logistics and distribution, building networks that moved alcohol from ships offshore to warehouses to speakeasies with military precision. His organization didn't manufacture much product themselves. They were the middlemen, the facilitators. But they took a cut of everything that moved through their network, whether it was safe imported cognac or poisonous bathtub gin. Lansky's philosophy was simple. People were going to drink regardless, so there was no point being squeamish about what you sold them. The mob's involvement in bootlegging had long-term consequences that outlasted Prohibition. The money they made funded expansion into other illegal enterprises: gambling, prostitution, labor racketeering, drug trafficking. The political connections they bought stayed bought, corrupting city governments for decades. The organizational structures they built became templates for modern organized crime. And the violence they normalized, the drive-by shootings, the bombings, the assassinations, became part of American culture. When Prohibition ended in 1933, many in law enforcement hoped organized crime would collapse without its primary revenue source. Instead, the mob simply diversified. They already had the infrastructure, the experience, and the political connections. Prohibition had been a graduate education in criminal enterprise, and they'd passed with honors. The legacy of bootlegging wasn't just the thousands who died from poisoned alcohol. It was the permanent entrenchment of organized crime in American life, a cancer that metastasized from illegal liquor into every dark corner of society. Prohibition changed the drinking habits of American women forever. Before the 18th Amendment, respectable women rarely drank in public. But during the 1920s, flappers stormed into speakeasies, ordered cocktails, and drank alongside men as a symbol of liberation and defiance. Unfortunately, this newfound freedom came with deadly risks. Women were just as likely as men to consume poisoned alcohol, and in some ways, they were more vulnerable. Many women had less experience with alcohol and couldn't gauge when something was dangerously wrong. Others were pressured by dates or friends into drinking, even when they felt uneasy. And when women were poisoned, the stigma was even worse. A woman who went blind or died from bootleg liquor was often blamed for her own demise. She shouldn't have been drinking in the first place. Families hid the cause of death out of shame. The victims became invisible, erased by a society that saw their suffering as deserved. The flapper era was supposed to be about liberation. Women cut their hair short, raised their hemlines, got jobs, smoked cigarettes, and, most scandalously, drank in public. Before Prohibition, saloons had been almost exclusively male spaces. Women who entered them were assumed to be prostitutes or women of loose morals. But speakeasies were different. They were illegal for everyone, which paradoxically made them more democratic. Men and women drank side by side, danced together, and participated equally in breaking the law. For many young women, this felt revolutionary. But the revolution had a body count. Young women who'd never drunk anything stronger than communion wine suddenly had access to high-proof bootleg gin with no understanding of how to drink it safely, if such a thing even existed during Prohibition. They didn't know to eat first, to drink slowly, to watch for warning signs of poisoning. They didn't know that the pleasant buzz they were feeling could turn into permanent blindness in a matter of hours. And when something went wrong, they often didn't know to seek medical help immediately, either because they were ashamed or because they didn't want their families to find out they'd been drinking. The double standard was vicious. When a man got drunk and made a fool of himself, it was boys being boys. When a woman did the same, she was a disgrace to her family. When a man went blind from poisoned alcohol, he was a victim of Prohibition's excesses. When a woman did, she was a cautionary tale about what happens to girls who stray from the path of virtue. Newspapers sometimes didn't even report women's poisoning deaths, considering them too shameful to mention. Or they'd report them without naming the victim, protecting the family's reputation, even as they buried their daughter. College-aged women were particularly vulnerable. They'd leave home for the first time, eager to experience the excitement of city life and the freedom of the jazz age. They'd be invited to parties where everyone was drinking, and not drinking meant being left out, being seen as prudish or unsophisticated. So they'd accept drinks from people they barely knew, trusting that the alcohol was safe, because everyone else was drinking it too. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they woke up blind. Pregnant women who drank poisoned alcohol faced additional horrors. Methanol and other toxins crossed the placental barrier, poisoning both mother and fetus. Some women miscarried. Others delivered babies with birth defects or developmental disabilities. The medical establishment had little understanding of fetal alcohol syndrome, so these outcomes were often attributed to moral failings rather than chemical poisoning. Women who lost babies to bootleg alcohol carried not just grief, but shame, blamed by doctors and society for the deaths of their children. Working-class women and women of color faced the worst outcomes. They had less access to expensive imported liquor and relied more heavily on cheap bootleg from neighborhood dealers. They had less access to medical care when things went wrong, and they faced more severe social consequences when their drinking was discovered. A wealthy white woman who went blind from poisoned champagne might be quietly sent to a sanitarium and her condition hidden from society. A poor black woman who went blind from bathtub gin would lose her job, her home, and any hope of support. The women who survived poisoning often faced lives of extreme hardship. Blind women in the 1920s had few options for employment or independence. Many ended up in institutions or dependent on families who resented having to care for them. Some turned to begging. Others simply disappeared from public record, their fates unknown. They'd reached for freedom and equality, for the right to make their own choices, and the price they paid was everything. By 1933, it was clear that Prohibition had failed spectacularly. Crime was rampant. The government was losing millions in tax revenue, and the death toll from poisoned alcohol had reached catastrophic levels. Estimates suggest that during the 13 years of Prohibition, at least 10,000 Americans died from drinking tainted alcohol, and countless more were blinded, paralyzed, or permanently disabled. When Franklin D. Roosevelt took office and signed the 21st Amendment repealing Prohibition, the nation breathed a collective sigh of relief. Legal alcohol returned, distilleries reopened, the government could regulate quality again. But the damage was done. Thousands were dead. Organized crime had gained a foothold it would never fully relinquish. And an entire generation had learned that when the government tries to legislate morality, the consequences can be deadly. The repeal movement gained momentum through the early 1930s as the Great Depression made Prohibition's failures impossible to ignore. People were hungry, unemployed, and desperate. The government was broke, unable to fund relief programs while losing hundreds of millions in potential tax revenue from legal alcohol sales. Meanwhile, organized crime was getting richer and more powerful every day, and bodies were still stacking up in hospital morgues from poisoned liquor. The math wasn't complicated. Prohibition was an expensive failure that killed people and enriched criminals while solving none of the social problems it was supposed to address. Roosevelt ran for president in 1932 on a platform that included repealing Prohibition. When he won in a landslide, it was clear the country had turned against the noble experiment. The 21st Amendment was ratified on December 5, 1933, making it the only constitutional amendment ever passed specifically to repeal another amendment. The 18th Amendment was dead. The bars reopened. And for the first time in 13 years, Americans could legally buy a drink without wondering if it would kill them. The celebration was bittersweet. Yes, legal alcohol was back. But the victory came too late for the thousands who died and the tens of thousands who'd been permanently disabled. In New York alone, the medical examiner's office had documented over 700 deaths from poisoned alcohol during Prohibition's final years. Multiply that across every major city in America, add in the rural deaths that were never properly documented, and include the victims who died weeks or months later from complications, and you're looking at a conservative estimate of 10,000 dead, with some historians suggesting the real number was much higher. Then there were the survivors who wished they'd died, men and women blinded by methanol, unable to work, dependent on families who couldn't afford to support them. Victims of Jake Leg, dragging their paralyzed feet through lives that offered no accommodation for disability. People with permanent organ damage, chronic pain, neurological disorders. They lived in a world that had moved on, reopened the bars, and started selling safe, regulated alcohol as if the previous 13 years had been a bad dream. But for them, the nightmare never ended. The government never apologized. There was no compensation fund for victims. No official acknowledgement that the denaturing program had been a catastrophic mistake. Treasury officials simply stopped adding poisons to industrial alcohol and moved on to other matters. The politicians who'd championed Prohibition either retired quietly or pivoted to other causes. Wayne Wheeler, the anti-Saloon League leader who'd called the poisoning victims deliberate suicides, died in 1927, never having to answer for the consequences of the policies he'd promoted. Organized crime did take a hit when Prohibition ended. Their most lucrative revenue stream dried up overnight. But they'd spent 13 years building empires, accumulating wealth, and buying political influence. They simply shifted focus to other illegal enterprises: gambling, prostitution, labor racketeering, and eventually narcotics. The infrastructure Prohibition had helped them build, the networks, the corruption, the violence, remained intact and profitable. The lessons of Prohibition were clear, but America learned the wrong ones. Instead of recognizing that Prohibition itself was the problem, many concluded that the issue was insufficient enforcement. Instead of understanding that people would continue to seek intoxication regardless of legality, and that regulation was safer than prohibition, the country doubled down on moral crusades. Within decades, similar logic would be applied to other substances, with similar results. Black markets, violence, contaminated products, mass incarceration, and preventable death. The bodies are still being counted. For those who survived drinking poisoned alcohol, the nightmare didn't end when Prohibition was repealed. Many victims lived with permanent disabilities: blindness, nerve damage, cognitive impairment, kidney failure. Jake Leg sufferers shuffled through life unable to walk normally, forever marked by their decision to drink illegal medicine that turned out to be poison. Blind men and women navigated a world that offered little support for the disabled, forced to beg, rely on family, or live in institutions. Some survivors developed chronic health issues years later: liver disease, neurological disorders, early onset dementia. The full scope of the public health crisis was never properly documented because so many victims were poor, marginalized, or too ashamed to seek help. Their suffering became a footnote in history, a grim reminder that policy decisions have human costs. Methanol poisoning didn't just destroy your vision, it could cause permanent damage throughout your body. Survivors often suffered from persistent headaches, memory problems, and difficulty concentrating. The formic acid that destroyed optic nerves could also damage other parts of the nervous system, leading to tremors, numbness, and chronic pain. Some victims developed what we'd now recognize as traumatic brain injury symptoms: mood swings, depression, difficulty with impulse control. In the 1920s and 30s, these were just called personality changes, and victims were often blamed for being difficult or unstable. The kidney damage from chronic exposure to bootleg alcohol was particularly insidious. Your kidneys are responsible for filtering toxins from your blood, and when you repeatedly expose them to methanol, benzene, and other industrial poisons, they start to fail. Victims developed chronic kidney disease, experiencing fatigue, swelling, high blood pressure, and eventually complete renal failure. In an era before dialysis or transplants, kidney failure was a death sentence, just a slower one than acute poisoning. These victims survived the initial poisoning only to die years later from complications that were never officially connected to their Prohibition-era drinking. Liver damage was equally common. Your liver metabolizes alcohol, and when that alcohol is contaminated with toxic chemicals, your liver bears the brunt. Cirrhosis, scarring of the liver tissue, developed in many survivors, even those who'd only drunk poisoned alcohol for a relatively short time. The combination of high alcohol content and chemical toxins created a perfect storm of hepatotoxicity. Victims developed jaundice, their skin and eyes turning yellow. Their abdomens swelled with fluid. They bruised easily and bled internally. And they died, often before reaching 40, their livers destroyed by poison their own government had added to the alcohol supply. The neurological effects of Jake Leg were particularly cruel because they were so visible. Victims walked with a distinctive gait, their feet slapping the ground because they couldn't control their toe muscles. People called it the Jake Walk or the Jake Wobble, and it became a mark of shame. Employers wouldn't hire people who walked that way, assuming they were drunks or morally deficient. Victims lost jobs, homes, marriages. They were mocked in the streets. Children pointed and laughed. The disability was permanent. The peripheral nerves destroyed by TOCP couldn't regenerate, so victims carried that mark for the rest of their lives, a constant reminder of one bad decision to drink what they thought was medicine. Blindness from methanol poisoning was often incomplete, which in some ways made it worse. Instead of total darkness, victims lived in a world of blurs, shadows, and ghost images. They could sometimes see shapes and light, but no detail. They'd navigate by memory and touch, constantly bumping into things, constantly dependent on others. The 1920s offered almost no support services for the blind. There were a few schools and training programs, but most victims had no access to them. They were simply expected to depend on family charity or institutions. Mental health effects were widespread, but rarely acknowledged. Imagine waking up one morning to discover you're blind, or paralyzed, or brain damaged, and knowing it's permanent, irreversible, your own fault for drinking illegal alcohol. The trauma, grief, and rage were overwhelming. Many victims developed what we'd now call PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety attacks. Others sank into deep depression. Suicide rates among poisoning survivors were high, though these deaths were rarely recorded as connected to Prohibition. They were just sad stories, personal tragedies, not policy outcomes. The children of poisoning victims suffered too. Growing up with a blind or disabled parent in an era of limited social support meant poverty, instability, and often institutionalization. Some children were forced to leave school to care for disabled parents. Others were sent to orphanages or relatives. The trauma rippled through generations, affecting families for decades after Prohibition ended. These weren't just individual health crises. They were social catastrophes that destroyed entire family networks. And through it all, the government maintained its silence. In May, health surveys were conducted to assess the full scope of the damage. No victim compensation programs were established. No long-term studies tracked the health outcomes of survivors. The victims were expected to simply live with the consequences of policies that had valued moral crusading over human life. And they did, carrying their disabilities and trauma in silence, invisible casualties of America's great failed experiment. If you're paying attention, you might notice some uncomfortable parallels between Prohibition-era alcohol poisoning and modern drug policy. Today, fentanyl-laced street drugs kill tens of thousands of Americans every year, just as poisoned alcohol did in the 1920s. The pattern is eerily similar. The government bans a substance, people continue to use it anyway, and a black market emerges with no quality control, leading to mass death. Some advocates argue for harm reduction strategies, safe injection sites, drug testing, decriminalization, just as some doctors in the 1920s begged the government to stop poisoning industrial alcohol. Others insist that the answer is stricter enforcement, harsher penalties, zero tolerance. History suggests that approach doesn't work, but history also suggests we're not very good at learning from it. The parallels are almost painful in their precision. During Prohibition, the government knew people were drinking industrial alcohol and decided to make it deadly as a deterrent. Today, the government knows people are using illegal drugs and responds primarily with criminalization and interdiction, pushing users toward increasingly dangerous substances. During Prohibition, the alcohol supply became contaminated with poisons users couldn't detect: methanol, benzene, TOCP. Today, the drug supply is contaminated with fentanyl, carfentanil, and novel synthetic opioids that users can't detect. During Prohibition, thousands died from substances they thought were safe. Today, thousands die the same way. The fentanyl crisis is particularly instructive. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid 50 times more potent than heroin. It's cheap to manufacture and easy to smuggle, making it attractive to drug traffickers. But it's also deadly in tiny doses. 2 milligrams can kill an adult, and it's being mixed into heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and even counterfeit prescription pills. Users think they're buying one drug and get something completely different, often with fatal results. Sound familiar? It's the bootleg gin problem all over again, just with different chemicals. Harm reduction advocates have proposed solutions that echo the advice ignored during Prohibition. Drug testing services that let users check their substances for fentanyl and other contaminants, just like the chemists who tried to develop safe testing methods for bootleg alcohol. Safe consumption sites where users can be monitored and revived if they overdose, just like the doctors who begged for treatment resources instead of punishment. Decriminalization and regulation that would allow quality control, just like the voices that argued for repealing Prohibition rather than poisoning the supply. And just like during Prohibition, these proposals are met with moral outrage and accusations of enabling addiction. The enforcement-focused approach has failed by every measurable standard. Drug use hasn't decreased, it's increased. Drug-related deaths haven't decreased, they've skyrocketed, with over 100,000 Americans dying from overdoses in 2021 alone. The black market hasn't been eliminated. It's more sophisticated and profitable than ever. And just as Prohibition enriched gangsters like Al Capone, drug prohibition has enriched cartels and criminal organizations around the world. The arguments against harm reduction today are nearly identical to the arguments used to defend denaturing during Prohibition. We can't make it safe to break the law. Users need to face consequences for their choices. Protecting them from the dangers of illegal substances sends the wrong message. These sound reasonable until you realize their justifications for allowing preventable deaths. During Prohibition, that meant accepting that thousands would die from poisoned alcohol. Today, it means accepting that thousands will die from contaminated drugs. Some cities and states have begun implementing harm reduction strategies despite federal resistance. Vancouver has safe injection sites where users can consume drugs under medical supervision, and overdose deaths at those facilities are essentially zero. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001 and invested in treatment instead of incarceration. Their overdose rates dropped dramatically. These are the modern equivalents of the chemists who tried to purify industrial alcohol and the doctors who fought against the denaturing program. People trying to save lives within a system that often seems designed to let people die. The tragedy is that we have a historical case study showing exactly what happens when prohibition meets poison, and we've chosen to ignore it. We watched Prohibition kill 10,000 Americans with contaminated alcohol, and then we built a drug policy that does the same thing with different substances. We documented the rise of organized crime during Prohibition, and then we created conditions that allow drug cartels to thrive. We saw the failure of moral crusading over pragmatic health policy, and then we did it again. History doesn't repeat, they say, but it rhymes. And right now, it's rhyming with the screams of people dying from substances that could be made safer if we valued lives over ideology. The question is whether we'll learn the lesson before the body count becomes unbearable. Based on Prohibition, the answer isn't encouraging. Ask most people what they know about Prohibition, and you'll hear about flappers, jazz, Al Capone, and speakeasies, glamorous, rebellious, fun. The use, reality of mass poisoning, government-sponsored death, and thousands of preventable tragedies has been largely erased from popular memory. Hollywood loves the aesthetics of the era, but rarely engages with its darkest truths. We've turned a public health catastrophe into a costume party. This sanitized version of history serves a purpose. It allows us to celebrate the repeal of Prohibition as a victory for freedom without reckoning with the suffering that came before it. But the victims deserve better. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics or cautionary tales, but as real people who died because their government chose punishment over compassion, morality over mercy, and ideology over human life. The romanticization of Prohibition began almost as soon as it ended. Within years, the speakeasy era was being mythologized in movies, books, and songs. The Thin Man series portrayed wealthy sophisticates bantering wittily over martinis. The Untouchables turned federal agents into heroes fighting noble battles against evil gangsters. Guys and Dolls made bootleggers charming and lovable. The aesthetic was irresistible. Art Deco glamour, jazz music, beautiful women in beaded dresses, men in sharp suits, the thrill of breaking the law for a good time. But this version of Prohibition is a lie by omission. It's not technically false. Those things did happen. Wealthy people did drink champagne in elegant speakeasies. Flappers did dance the Charleston. Jazz did flourish in the underground clubs. But this wasn't the experience of most Americans. For every glamorous speakeasy in Manhattan, there were 100 basement dives serving poison to poor workers. For every sophisticated cocktail party, there were 1,000 people going blind from bathtub gin. The popular image of Prohibition is class-specific. It's rich people's prohibition, and it erases the working class experience entirely. Hollywood is particularly complicit in this myth-making. Boardwalk Empire, set during Prohibition, is beautifully shot and meticulously detailed, but it focuses on gangsters and politicians, not on the victims of poisoned alcohol. The Great Gatsby gives us lavish parties and mysterious millionaires, but barely mentions that the bootleg liquor-funding Gatsby's lifestyle was killing people every day. Even The Untouchables, which portrays Prohibition's violence, treats it as a war between good guys and bad guys rather than a public health crisis created by bad policy. The sanitization extends to education. High school history classes teach that Prohibition was a failed social experiment that led to organized crime and was eventually repealed. True, but incomplete. How many students learn that the government deliberately poisoned the alcohol supply? How many learn about the Christmas 1926 massacre, the Jake Leg epidemic, or the doctors who begged Congress to stop killing American citizens? These facts are relegated to footnotes, if they're mentioned at all. The curriculum focuses on the 18th and 21st Amendments, Al Capone's arrest for tax evasion, and maybe the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The 10,000 dead from poisoned alcohol are invisible. This cultural amnesia serves several purposes. First, it makes Prohibition a safe historical topic, quirky, interesting, safely in the past. If we acknowledge the government's role in mass poisoning, we'd have to reckon with the fact that American policy can be murderous and that officials will defend indefensible policies rather than admit mistakes. That's uncomfortable. Second, it allows us to celebrate the end of Prohibition without examining why it was implemented in the first place, or whether we're repeating similar patterns with other prohibitions. Third, it protects the reputations of institutions and families who'd prefer not to discuss great-grandpa's role in defending a poisoning program, or great-grandma's death from bathtub gin. The victims deserve better than to be erased by nostalgia and aesthetics. Giuseppe Morone, who died on Christmas trying to celebrate with his family, deserves to be remembered. Mary O'Brien, who went blind drinking a single cocktail, deserves to be remembered. The thousands of Jake Leg victims, the children orphaned by poisoning, the doctors who fought to save lives, all of them deserve to be part of the story we tell about Prohibition. But instead we get costume parties. We get Prohibition-themed bars where you knock on unmarked doors and order cocktails with clever names. We get fashion spreads featuring flapper dresses and pocket watches. We get the aesthetic without the agony, the style without the substance, the romance without the reality. It's history as entertainment, tragedy as branding, mass death as a theme for your birthday party. Maybe it's time to tell the whole story? Why did some people drink methanol and survive while others died or went blind? The answer lies in a combination of dosage, individual biology, and sheer luck. A small amount of methanol might cause illness, but not death. A slightly larger dose could destroy your optic nerves. An even larger amount could shut down your organs entirely. Your body's ability to metabolize the poison depended on factors like your liver health, whether you'd eaten recently, and whether you'd consumed ethanol at the same time, which can slow methanol metabolism, and buy your body time to filter it out. Some victims got medical treatment quickly enough to make a difference. Others didn't. And in many cases, the concentration of methanol in the bootleg liquor varied wildly even within the same batch, meaning one person might drink from a bottle and be fine while the next person drank from the same bottle and dropped dead. It was Russian roulette in liquid form. The lethal dose of methanol varies significantly between individuals, but the range is terrifyingly narrow. For an average adult, as little as 10 milliliters, about 2 teaspoons of pure, Methanol can cause blindness. 30 milliliters can be fatal. But these are estimates based on pure methanol consumed on an empty stomach by someone with average liver function. Change any of those variables, and the numbers shift. A larger person with a healthy liver might survive a dose that would kill someone smaller with compromised liver function. Someone who'd eaten a large, fatty meal might metabolize the poison more slowly, giving their kidneys more time to excrete it before it reached lethal concentrations. Someone who'd consumed ethanol along with the methanol, which was almost always the case with bootleg liquor, might survive because ethanol and methanol compete for the same metabolic enzymes. This enzyme competition is key to understanding why some people survived. When you consume both ethanol and methanol, your body prioritizes metabolizing the ethanol because it recognizes it as the primary alcohol. While your liver is busy breaking down ethanol, the methanol just sits in your bloodstream, unchanged and relatively harmless. Your kidneys continue filtering it out slowly through urine. If enough time passes before your liver gets around to metabolizing the methanol, you might excrete most of it before it becomes toxic. This is why the medical treatment for methanol poisoning is, ironically, drinking more ethanol. It keeps your liver busy while your kidneys do the cleanup. But bootleg liquor during Prohibition was never consistent. A single barrel might contain varying concentrations of methanol depending on how thoroughly it was mixed. The first bottles drawn from a batch might be relatively safe while the last bottles were lethal, or vice versa. Some bootleggers would mix newly redistilled alcohol with older stock, creating unpredictable chemical cocktails. You could buy a bottle from the same dealer you'd bought from safely before, and this time get a dose that killed you. Individual biology played a huge role in outcomes. Your liver contains enzymes called alcohol dehydrogenase and aldehyde dehydrogenase, which break down alcohol. The efficiency of these enzymes varies significantly between individuals based on genetics. Some people metabolize alcohol quickly, others slowly. If you were a slow metabolizer, methanol stayed in your system longer, giving you more time to excrete it safely. If you were a fast metabolizer, you converted it to toxic formaldehyde and formic acid quickly, giving it more time to damage your organs before your body could eliminate it. There was no way to know which category you fell into until it was too late. Age, sex, and overall health mattered too. Older people and those with liver disease metabolized methanol more slowly and were more vulnerable to its effects. Women generally have lower levels of alcohol dehydrogenase than men, which paradoxically might have protected them slightly by slowing the conversion of methanol to its toxic metabolites. But women also tend to weigh less than men, meaning the same dose represents a higher concentration in their bloodstream. These factors balanced out in complicated ways, making it nearly impossible to predict who would survive and who wouldn't. The timing of medical intervention could mean the difference between life and death, but only if the treatment was appropriate and administered early enough. If you got to a hospital quickly and the doctors understood what they were dealing with, they might save you. They'd pump your stomach if the alcohol was recent, give you ethanol to compete with methanol metabolism, and administer sodium bicarbonate to combat acidosis. If they acted within the first few hours, your chances were decent. But if you waited too long, if the methanol had already been metabolized into formaldehyde and formic acid, if the damage to your optic nerves had already begun, there was nothing anyone could do. You'd go blind, and that was that. The cruelest aspect of methanol poisoning is its delayed onset. You could drink poison and feel fine for 12 to 24 hours while it circulated harmlessly in your bloodstream. You'd go to bed thinking you'd had a good night out, and you'd wake up with a headache and blurred vision that would never go away. By the time symptoms appeared, the window for effective treatment had often closed. People who survived often did so not because of medical intervention, but because they'd gotten lucky. They'd consumed a sublethal dose, or their body had metabolized and excreted it unusually quickly, or they'd eaten something that delayed absorption. It was lottery-level luck, except the prize was continuing to be alive and able to see. Tonight, as you sit in the safety of the 21st century with your legally produced, government-regulated beverage of choice, take a moment to think about the thousands of Americans who weren't so lucky. Think about the young man who went blind drinking bathtub gin at a New Year's Eve party in 1927. Think about the mother of 3 who died from Jake Leg, her children left orphaned because she drank illegal medicine that turned out to be poison. Think about the immigrants who came to America searching for a better life and found only a shot of methanol in a tenement speakeasy. They were casualties of a war on alcohol that killed more people than alcohol itself ever had when it was legal. They were victims of moral panic, legislative overreach, and a government that decided some deaths were acceptable in the pursuit of a sober society. And they deserve to be remembered, not as criminals or cautionary tales, but as human beings who wanted the same thing we all do: a moment of joy, a bit of escape, and the simple freedom to make their own choices. Viva la vida, long live life. Even when history tries to poison it, the dead have no voice, so we must speak for them. Giuseppe Marone, who wanted to celebrate Christmas with his family. Mary O'Brien, who wanted to experience city life and independence. The unnamed thousands who simply wanted a drink at the end of a hard day, a toast at a wedding, a moment of forgetting during difficult times. They weren't moral monsters. They weren't criminal masterminds. They were ordinary people living in extraordinary circumstances, trying to navigate a world where the government had declared their normal human behavior illegal and then poisoned the supply to prove a point. Their deaths should haunt us. Not because they drank. Alcohol consumption is as old as civilization itself. But because their deaths were preventable, predictable, and in many cases, intentionally caused by the very government that was supposed to protect them. When officials at the Treasury Department strengthened the denaturing formulas, they knew people would die. When legislators refused to stop the poisoning program despite mounting evidence of mass death, they chose ideology over human life. When Prohibition advocates dismissed the victims as criminals who deserved their fate, they revealed a callousness that should shock us. But here's what should really keep us awake at night. It could happen again. It is happening again. The patterns that led to Prohibition's poisoning crisis, moral panic, legislative overreach, refusal to acknowledge policy failures, acceptance of collateral damage in pursuit of a drug-free society, are still with us. The substances have changed, but the logic remains the same, and people are still dying in numbers that would have been unthinkable if we'd actually learned anything from Prohibition. The legacy of Prohibition isn't just the 10,000 dead from poisoned alcohol. It's the lesson we failed to learn, that Prohibition doesn't eliminate desire. It just makes satisfying that desire dangerous. That black markets don't follow safety regulations. That desperate people will take desperate risks. That punishment is not prevention. That policy designed to protect people from themselves often ends up killing them instead. If we truly want to honor the victims of Prohibition, we need to do more than remember them. We need to make sure their deaths meant something. We need to recognize that the same patterns are playing out with different substances. We need to choose evidence over ideology, harm reduction over moral crusading, human life over political posturing. We need to understand that people will always seek altered states of consciousness, and our choice isn't between use and non-use, it's between regulated markets and dangerous black markets, between safety and suffering, between life and death. The ghosts of prohibition are all around us. They're in the emergency rooms where overdose victims are revived or pronounced dead. They're in the courtrooms where drug offenders are sentenced to years in prison for possession. They're in the morgues where medical examiners document another preventable death from contaminated substances. They're in the policy discussions where the same failed approaches are proposed again and again. They're whispering, "We died so you wouldn't have to. We paid the price for this lesson. Please, for the love of God, learn it. Tonight, raise a glass, safe, legal, regulated, to the forgotten dead of prohibition. To Giuseppe and Mary and all the unnamed thousands. To the victims of Jake Legg who shuffled through life on paralyzed feet. To the blind who navigated a world that offered them no support. To the children orphaned by poisoned alcohol. To the doctors who fought to save lives and were ignored. To the chemists who documented the deaths and begged for change. To everyone who suffered and died because their government chose punishment over compassion. And then ask yourself, what are we willing to do to make sure it never happens again? Viva la vida. Long live life. All of it. Even the messy, imperfect, sometimes intoxicated parts. Because the alternative we already tried, leaves nothing but bodies and regret. In the face of government denial and public confusion about what was actually killing people, some doctors took matters into their own hands in the most direct way possible. They drank the poison themselves. Dr. Charles Norris, New York's chief medical examiner, famously tested bootleg alcohol samples on himself to document the effects. Other physicians followed suit, carefully consuming small amounts of suspected methanol-contaminated liquor and recording their symptoms. It was medical martyrdom, scientific courage bordering on insanity. They developed blurred vision, severe headaches, nausea, and abdominal pain. Then published their findings in medical journals as evidence that the government's denaturing program was creating a public health catastrophe. Some of these doctors suffered permanent damage from their experiments, but they felt they had no choice. If the government wouldn't listen to statistics, autopsies, or chemical analysis, maybe they'd listen to doctors describing their own poisoning in real time. Dr. Norris was particularly relentless in his self-experimentation. He'd obtain samples of bootleg liquor from police raids or from victims' families, have them analyzed in his laboratory, and then, against all common sense and medical ethics, consume small measured doses himself. He'd sit in his office with a notebook, documenting the onset of symptoms, the initial burning sensation, the gradual blurring of vision, the intense headache that felt like his skull was being compressed in a vice, the nausea that came in waves. His assistants would monitor his vital signs, ready to intervene if things got too dangerous. Why would a respected medical professional do this? Because words weren't working. Norris had been showing politicians and journalists the bodies of poisoning victims for years. He'd conducted hundreds of autopsies, held press conferences, published papers, testified before Congress, and nothing changed. The Treasury Department continued strengthening the denaturing formulas. Prohibition advocates continued dismissing the deaths as the deserved consequences of lawbreaking. The public, bombarded with mixed messages, wasn't sure what to believe. So, Norris decided to make it personal. If he, a prominent, respectable doctor with no history of alcoholism or criminal behavior, could be poisoned by bootleg alcohol, then anyone could. His testimony shifted from "these people died" to "I personally experienced these symptoms." It was harder to dismiss, harder to blame on moral failing or pre-existing conditions. This wasn't some anonymous immigrant or chronic drunk. This was Dr. Charles Norris, one of the most respected forensic pathologists in America, telling senators to their faces that the government's policy had made him temporarily blind. Other doctors joined the dangerous experiment. Some tested bootleg samples before treating poisoning victims, trying to understand dosage and symptoms. Others drank alongside patients in hospitals, documenting parallel experiences to prove the connection between the alcohol and the illness. It was ethically questionable at best. These were medical professionals deliberately poisoning themselves for research purposes. But in an era when controlled clinical trials didn't exist, and the government was actively denying the problem, it was one of the few ways to generate undeniable evidence. The risks were real and sometimes permanent. Several doctors developed chronic eye problems from their experiments. Others suffered lasting neurological damage. At least one doctor died, though his death was attributed to other causes, officially. His colleagues knew better. He'd been testing progressively stronger concentrations of methanol-contaminated alcohol, pushing the boundaries of survivable doses when his liver finally gave out. He was 43 years old. These self-experimentations did generate publicity and temporarily shift public opinion. Newspapers ran stories with headlines like "Doctor Poisons Self to Prove Bootleg Danger." For a brief moment, the human cost of prohibition became undeniable. But even this wasn't enough to change policy. The government acknowledged that, yes, bootleg alcohol was dangerous, and reiterated that people simply shouldn't drink it. The denaturing program continued, the deaths continued, and the doctors who'd sacrificed their own health to prove a point were left with damaged vision, chronic pain, and the bitter knowledge that their martyrdom had changed nothing. While small-time bootleggers distilled poison in basement stills and bathtubs, sophisticated international smuggling operations were moving millions of gallons of real, safe alcohol into the United States from Canada, the Caribbean, and Europe. These weren't mom-and-pop operations. They were complex criminal enterprises with ships, planes, trucks, bribes, and violence. Rum Row, the line of ships anchored just outside U.S. territorial waters, stretched from New York to Florida, a floating warehouse of liquor waiting to be ferried to shore. Canadian distilleries ramped up production specifically to supply the American black market, creating a cross-border trade that enriched organized crime on both sides. The wealthy could afford imported liquor, which meant they weren't drinking poison. The poor couldn't, which meant they were. Prohibition didn't stop alcohol consumption. It just created a two-tier system where your survival depended on how much money you had. The geography of North America made smuggling almost impossible to stop. The U.S.-Canada border stretched nearly 4,000 miles, much of it remote wilderness, frozen lakes, or dense forest. Smugglers moved Canadian whiskey across the Detroit River in boats, through the forests of Minnesota and Montana on horseback, and across frozen Lake Erie on sleds in winter. Some entrepreneurs built tunnels under the border. Others bribed customs officials and simply drove shipments through official checkpoints in broad daylight. The maritime routes were even more audacious. ships from England, France, Scotland, and the Caribbean would anchor 12 miles offshore, just beyond the 3-mile limit the Coast Guard could legally patrol, and wait. Smaller, faster boats would race out from shore, load up with cases of genuine Scotch, French cognac, or Caribbean rum, and speed back before authorities could intercept them. The larger ships carried tens of thousands of cases, floating warehouses that did business around the clock. Some remained on station for months, becoming floating communities with their own hierarchies and rules. The Coast Guard tried to stop them, but was hopelessly outmatched. They had a few dozen vessels to patrol thousands of miles of coastline. The rum runners had hundreds of boats, many of them faster and better equipped. It became a cat and mouse game where the cats were underfunded and the mice were making millions. When the Coast Guard did catch a rum runner, the penalties were often minor, a fine, maybe some jail time, and the potential profits were enormous. Getting caught was just a cost of doing business. Air smuggling emerged as technology advanced. Small planes would fly from Canada or the Bahamas, loaded with cases of liquor, and land on remote airstrips or even beaches along the coast. Some pilots became legends, known for their daring runs and narrow escapes. One aviator claimed to have made over 300 smuggling flights without ever being caught, bringing in millions of dollars worth of genuine imported alcohol. The corruption required to make all this work was staggering. Smugglers paid off Coast Guard officers, customs officials, local police, judges, and politicians. Some officials became partners in smuggling operations, using their positions to facilitate shipments and eliminate competitors. In some coastal towns, smuggling was the primary industry, and everyone from the mayor to the pastor was involved. The money was simply too good to resist. But here's the crucial point. The people drinking this imported liquor weren't going blind. They weren't dying from methanol poisoning or developing Jake leg. Because it was real alcohol, produced in legitimate distilleries with quality control and safety standards. The wealthy who could afford $5 for a bottle of genuine Scotch were safe. The poor, who could only afford 50 cents for bathtub gin, were playing Russian roulette. Prohibition created a class divide where the rich broke the law safely and the poor broke it at the risk of death or disability. This two-tier system was never explicitly discussed, but everyone understood it. You'd never hear about a Wall Street banker going blind from poisoned champagne or a society matron dying from contaminated cognac. Those deaths happened in tenements, in immigrant neighborhoods, in black communities in the South, in working-class districts where people couldn't afford the luxury of safety. The government's poisoning program effectively punished poverty. If you were rich enough to buy imported liquor, prohibition was an inconvenience and a moral adventure. If you were poor enough to need cheap bootleg, it was a potential death sentence. The smugglers themselves often marketed their product explicitly as safe. Genuine Canadian whiskey or real Scotch, not that industrial poison, became selling points. Some smugglers put quality guarantees on their bottles, not that they could be enforced, but the psychology worked. People were willing to pay more for alcohol they believed wouldn't kill them. And mostly, they were right. The imported stuff was safer, not because smugglers were more ethical than domestic bootleggers, but because they were selling actual liquor instead of redistilled industrial alcohol. When Prohibition ended, these smuggling networks didn't disappear, they just pivoted to other contraband. The infrastructure, the routes, the corruption, the expertise, all of it transferred to smuggling drugs, untaxed cigarettes, and other illegal goods. Prohibition had built a criminal superhighway that would endure for generations. The youngest victims of Prohibition are often forgotten in discussions of poisoning and death, but their suffering was profound and long-lasting. Children grew up in homes where parents drank bootleg alcohol, never knowing if tonight would be the night mom or dad went blind or died. Some children lost parents to poisoning and ended up in orphanages or with relatives who could barely feed themselves. Others grew up with disabled parents, taking on adult responsibilities at age 8 or 10, cooking, cleaning, earning money, caring for younger siblings, because mom couldn't see anymore or dad couldn't walk after drinking Jake. These children's childhoods were stolen by a policy that treated their parents' deaths as acceptable casualties. And many children drank the poison themselves, either accidentally or because they were offered alcohol at family celebrations, with tragic results. Children's exposure to bootleg alcohol took many forms, all of them devastating. In some households, parents hid their drinking from their children, but the effects were impossible to hide. A child might wake up to find their father unconscious, vomiting, or screaming about being unable to see. They'd watch their mother cry over bills they couldn't pay because dad was now permanently blind and couldn't work. They'd be pulled out of school to help support the family, their education ending in 3rd or 4th grade because survival came first. Other children grew up in environments where drinking bootleg alcohol was normalized. Family celebrations, weddings, holidays, birthdays featured homemade wine or bathtub gin. Adults would sometimes offer children sips, either as a joke or as an early introduction to drinking. Sometimes these sips were harmless. Sometimes they contained enough methanol to cause permanent damage. There are documented cases of children as young as 6 going blind from drinking bootleg alcohol at family parties. Their parents had no idea the drink was poisoned. By the time symptoms appeared, it was too late. Orphanages during Prohibition overflowed with children whose parents had died from poisoned alcohol. These institutions were already overcrowded and underfunded before Prohibition. The wave of poisoning deaths pushed them past capacity. Children slept 3 to a bed, ate watery gruel, and received minimal education or affection. Many were eventually adopted out or sent to work as farm laborers or domestic servants, essentially child labor justified as giving orphans a chance at a better life. Some children disappeared into the system entirely, their fates unrecorded. Children with disabled parents faced a different kind of suffering. Imagine being 10 years old and becoming the primary caregiver for your blind mother because your father left after she couldn't work anymore. You'd guide her around the apartment, describe what was happening in the street, read to her, shop for food, cook meals, and try to earn money any way you could, selling newspapers, shining shoes, running errands. Your childhood would consist of adult responsibilities and the constant fear that you weren't doing enough, that your mother would starve or get hurt because you'd failed to protect her. Teachers during the Prohibition era reported seeing increasing numbers of children coming to school exhausted, hungry, and unable to concentrate. When questioned, it often emerged that a parent had been disabled by bootleg alcohol and the child was now working nights or early mornings to help support the family. Schools couldn't do much beyond offer sympathy and the occasional free lunch. Social services barely existed, especially for poor and immigrant families. These children fell through every crack in society's floor. The psychological trauma was immense and rarely addressed. Children watched parents die in agony or descend into permanent disability. They learned that the adults they trusted couldn't keep them safe, that the government didn't care if they suffered, that life was fundamentally unfair and dangerous. Many developed what we'd now recognize as complex PTSD, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, difficulty forming attachments, anxiety disorders. In the 1920s, this was just called being a difficult child or having a nervous disposition. There was no therapy, no counseling, no acknowledgement that these children had been traumatized by policy. Some children grew up to be vocal advocates against prohibition, testifying about their experiences once they were adults. Others became lifelong teetotalers, so scarred by what they'd witnessed that they never touched alcohol. Still others became alcoholics themselves, trapped in cycles of addiction that had destroyed their parents. The trauma rippled through generations, affecting not just the children of prohibition, but their children and grandchildren. And through it all, these youngest victims remained largely invisible in the historical record. When newspapers reported poisoning deaths, they focused on adult victims. When politicians debated prohibition policy, they didn't consider the children being orphaned or traumatized. When historians later wrote about the era, they emphasized gangsters, speakeasies, and cultural change, not the 8-year-old leading his blind father through the streets, or the 12-year-old orphan scrubbing floors in an institution. These children's suffering was a footnote, if mentioned at all. But they were there, living through a catastrophe they didn't create and couldn't escape, paying the price for adults' moral crusading and ideological stubbornness. They deserved better then. They deserve to be remembered now. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your safe, regulated, 21st century world, take a moment to appreciate something you probably never think about. The fact that when you order a drink at a bar, it probably won't kill you. That when you check the label on a bottle, you can trust it actually contains what it says. That if you decide to have a cocktail, the biggest risk you face is a hangover, not permanent blindness or death by government-sponsored poisoning. The story of Prohibition's deadly bootleg alcohol isn't just a quirky historical footnote about the Roaring '20s. It's a tragedy that claimed at least 10,000 lives and destroyed tens of thousands more through blindness, paralysis, and permanent disability. It's the story of a government that decided moral crusading was more important than human life, that chose to poison its own citizens rather than admit a policy wasn't working. And it's a story we've chosen to forget, burying it under layers of glamorous Hollywood mythology, jazz music, and flapper dresses. But the victims deserve better than our amnesia. Giuseppe Morone, who died trying to celebrate Christmas with his family, Mary O'Brien, who went blind from a single cocktail at a party. The thousands of Jake leg sufferers who spent the rest of their lives unable to walk normally, marked forever by a decision to drink what they thought was medicine. The children orphaned when their parents drank poison. The doctors who fought against the denaturing program were ignored. The chemists who documented death after death and begged for change. They all deserve to be remembered. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Prohibition didn't fail because people were weak or immoral or couldn't control their drinking. It failed because prohibition itself is a failed strategy. You cannot legislate desire out of existence. You cannot punish people into sobriety. You cannot make something dangerous go away by making it illegal. You just make it more dangerous. Prohibition took alcohol, a substance humans have consumed for thousands of years, and turned it into a game of Russian roulette where every drink might be your last. and the pattern hasn't gone away. We're still fighting wars on drugs. We're still choosing punishment over treatment, criminalization over regulation, moral panic over evidence-based policy. And people are still dying from fentanyl-laced heroin, from contaminated street drugs, from substances that could be made safe if we valued human life more than ideological purity. The substances have changed, but the logic remains exactly the same, and so does the body count. The legacy of prohibition should be a warning, a massive flashing sign in our historical rearview mirror saying, "This approach kills people. Don't do it again." Instead, we've turned it into a costume party, a theme for speakeasy-style bars, an aesthetic divorced from its agonizing reality. We remember the jazz and the glamour and forget the morgues overflowing with poisoning victims, the hospital wards full of the blind and dying, the families destroyed by preventable tragedy. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let sleep take you, maybe spare a thought for all those who died because they wanted what you can have, legally and safely. A drink, a moment of escape, a little freedom to make their own choices. They paid the price for a lesson we still haven't fully learned. They died so we could understand that prohibition doesn't work, that poisoning people to prove a point is murder, that policy should be based on evidence and compassion, not ideology and punishment. Their deaths should matter. Their suffering should mean something, and the best way to honor them is to make sure we never repeat the mistakes that killed them. So, here's to the forgotten dead of prohibition. May they rest in peace, and may we finally learn the lesson they died to teach us. Sleep well, and be grateful that the world you live in, for all its flaws, at least doesn't require you to gamble with your life every time you want a drink. Because history was brutal, terrifying, and absolutely preventable. But somehow, despite everything, life found a way to continue. People survived. Lessons were learned, or at least they should have been. And morning always came, even after the darkest nights. Good night.